of her babies and she cries for home. Worst kind of pain, our baby mama's pain. Squeeze the bars till her hands turn blue. A razor cuts raindrops in two. She hears the screams from down the hall.
So it is it's Monday, June, let me get that date here. Okay, June 18th, 2018. I want to welcome you to Let's Talk Native on the LTN Radio Network. This program breaks all the rules for Native radio. No buffalo speeches, no mystic healing, no special Indian prayers. We tackle the real issues facing Native people, look back at our glorious and our grave history, a tough look at where we're at now, and look forward to our own ongoing battles for distinction and independence and autonomy. Let's Talk Native is produced in association with Iroquois Promotions on the LTN Radio Network, streaming live from the Cattaraugus territory of the Seneca Nation and simulcast on the Gwe, that's CKWE in Tandanega. You can find us at www.ltnradionet.com, and of course we are streaming live on Facebook. We are also now officially a podcast on iTunes, so I encourage you to search us on iTunes. I've posted up the link a few times, and I'll continue to do so on my Facebook group page. I am John Kane, and I am the show's host and producer. And I want to thank Kelly McMillan, who made the trip in today to help us tweak a few things. And we're going to look at doing some improvements with equipment and a few other things. And again, try to expand the platform that we have built here. Maybe even do some real FM broadcasts. We'll see what we can do as we go down the road here with this. But hey, my show is a little bit, and I've used this expression before, it's a little bit of a mixed bag. I have a few things that I want to get into, and primarily what I'm going to talk about today is definitions. And I think it's important that people realize that because we are not using our language, our original languages, that have meaning because of the etymology of those words. A lot of times our definitions are timeless. We use, we're not just putting labels on something. We're describing something in nature that essentially will be the same 200 years from now as it was 200 years ago. And many languages, the words change over time to a certain extent. But when you look at the etymology of some of those words and where those words come from, you realize that we may be using some of those words inappropriately. And we think we're saying one thing when we're kind of saying something else. And so I want to get into a little bit of definitions, but a couple of things I want to do right off the bat. Again, I wanted to mention that our shows are now podcasts, and you can find us on iTunes, so I encourage you to do that. I do appreciate when people share the show, share the Facebook live stream, share the SoundCloud audio, share the YouTube videos, and of course, now that we've kind of pierced that veil of podcasting, you can certainly share those as well. And the thing is, when you go onto iTunes and you find our podcast, you'll see that you can rate our shows, you can rate the audio, you can leave comments. There's a number of things you can do. As well, you can do that on YouTube. So I encourage, when people use these various platforms, if you're listening to us on Facebook, then let's have a conversation there. If you're listening to us on Twitter, add a comment, share share the audio, share the video, but use whatever platform you'd like. But let's have a conversation. Let's make sure that when we're addressing an issue either with this show, or if you think we should address an issue that we haven't touched. And I get that sometimes. In fact, I had somebody recently send me a bunch of stuff that they insist should go in front of the UN, and that I don't talk about enough important things. So what they thought was important is what I should talk about. And, of course, I take a little offense to that. I think many of the things that I talk about are certainly important to somebody. I mean, if I talk about kids being separated from the parents, hey, if you don't have kids, maybe that doesn't bother you at all. Maybe you're completely insensitive to the idea of ripping children away from their parents. Just because it's not important to you doesn't mean it's not important. So, yeah, again, I'm open to suggestions on show topics, and if you have some some credible information. And I'm not going to spin every conspiracy theory somebody wants to throw at me here, because trust me, I get a lot of those. Between this show and my show in New York, I get a lot of people who want to talk about, everything from, aliens to, to the fact that our origin, or to the, suggesting that our origins are with the Egyptians, and there's all kinds of stuff. I mean, and I don't give a whole lot of airtime to some of that. What I think is either quackery or something that is either so far removed from, I guess, what affects us on a daily basis that we're just speculating on almost nonsense, and I don't want to waste my time or the time of anybody listening, on that kind of stuff. So, but I do want to talk about important things and things that that affect us all. It's why we talk so much about identity. It's why we talk so much about culture and language and that kind of thing. Look, I would love to bring in somebody to do entire shows in Seneca or Mohawk or whatever, but unfortunately, we are utilizing English as a predominantly as the language that we communicate with. I think we have to be careful with that, and I think even if you don't speak the native languages, you should know enough about the native languages and where meanings come from that you can understand why certain English words don't necessarily apply. But and again, I'm going to get into that. Well, one of the things I wanted to do first off, I wanted to thank. We got a lot of views on the last show, so I want to thank all of you who not only checked out the last show, but shared the last show. And in the last show, I spoke a lot about this. First I talked about this idea of ripping kids away from parents at these border crossings and that kind of thing. But what I really talked about was how wrong it is for somebody to suggest that the act of ripping families apart is un-American. And so I spent a great deal of time on my last show talking about how American it is for the government and for for Americans to have ripped children away from their families, whether it was slave children. And again, I threw the numbers out there. I said, look, most of the slaves in the United States were not transatlantic Africans. They were born into slavery. Those were children that were ripped from their parents and born into bondage. So, yeah, when you want to talk about how un-American it is to take children away from their parents, the United States has been doing it for many, many years. I talked about the Native experience and what we went through in terms of not only our Native kids being orphaned by massacres and forced removal and poverty and starvation, but also kids that were ripped from the families for residential school. So, so that was the crux of the show. And many of you, we had a lot of views. We had about 2,000 views on that show. I know a lot of you shared it, and I think I struck a note with the topic and again the correlation between what is happening today and what has been American history, and of course we do a lot of that. So I wanted to mention that. One of the things that I did mention during the last show, and I want to reemphasize this. There is a big difference between law, the regulations that are associated with the law, how the law is implemented through its formal regulations, how that law is regulated, and then policy. And policy has to do with not just discretion on how and to what extent a law is enforced or regulations are enforced, but there are three different levels. The law is what Congress passes, okay? And then the regulations are oftentimes put together by the agencies charged with with enforcing those laws. And in many cases, those regulations have to be approved as well. And of course, even if you have a system of regulations on how law is supposed to be implemented, there is always that question of, well, discretion. I mean, when do you take something and go so strictly by the letter of the law that you forego any ability to show discretion and say, you know what, in this case, we're going to do X, Y, and Z. So when we talk about policy, I think it's important to realize that policy provides the flexibility to enforce or not enforce or alter how a law is enforced. This whole bit with these children that have been ripped from their parents is not bound by law, and it's not even bound by regulation. There are suggestions about prosecuting somebody who crosses the border, and then if you throw a bunch of laws on top of each other and a bunch of regulations on top of each other, you can say, well, if we prosecute adults, we lock them up because we're going to prosecute them, then we obviously have to strip the children away from them. That's not really the way things have been done in the past. I'm not saying it hasn't happened, but it hasn't been the broad-based policy. The decision to do this stuff rests squarely on the shoulders of Donald Trump, Jeff Sessions, Homeland Security, and these agencies that are not really that concerned about the children. They're not really that concerned. Yeah, I mean, this isn't even really about prosecuting the what they're calling these illegals. What this is about is trying to pressure, especially Democrats, to approve money for Trump to build his border wall, and that's the bottom line. You listen to Trump and even his wife, spewing out about, oh, we hate separating these children from their parents. If only the Democrats would pass, would change this terrible law. This terrible law that you are enforcing to such a specific letter that you're doing this terrible thing to children. Again, not new. It's been going on for many, many years. But I wanted to make sure that people understand there is a difference. It's almost like the levels of detail that, where a law gets passed, where the regulations get approved, and then the policy is what of that law and regulations do you enforce. This decision is a policy decision. And we went through this before with previous administrations. In fact, when the Obama administration passed an increase in the federal excise tax on tobacco, in that legislation there was a provision that would force what they call a floor tax to be administered, and a floor tax was product that was cleared at an old tax rate that had not gone into the commerce stream yet. And so the policy, the floor tax, was they would be reassessed the difference of that tax. Now, there was never any intent, either in the law or in the regulatory system that was applied to this law, for somebody to say, okay, we're going to go after the native people who've got cigarettes sitting on their shelves. But that's exactly what they tried to do. So that was a policy decision by the Internal Revenue Service and by the Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms. So this was a policy decision, not the law. And in fact, when we talked to folks who passed the law, and this was called CHIPRA because it was funding children's health insurance. It was the Children's Health Insurance Policy or Program Reauthorization Act. And we talked to the legislature, and they said, no, we never intended this thing to be enforced on native territories. So there was no legislative intent. And you could argue even the idea of proclaiming that somebody who crosses a border illegally should be prosecuted doesn't mean that the legislative intent was to throw the parents in jail and then lock up the kids somehow separately. That isn't the legislative intent. It may be a reading of the law that only a guy like, as heartless as Donald Trump or Jeff Sessions could utilize. And of course, the other beautiful thing about, and I talked about this last week, was Sessions quoting the Bible, Romans 13, as the justification. Turns out that passage often has been quoted and cited before. Hitler cited that stuff. The people who were against who were for slavery and wanted slaves to be captured and put back into bondage. They cited these kinds of laws because they said, well, the law, enforcing the law and obeying the law is affirmed in the Bible. And of course, this gets into this whole debate about whether where Jeff Sessions was claiming the United States as a government is ordained by God. No, he literally said that. And of course, this is that whole thing about governments and kingdoms and monarchs, the sovereign. And that's why I want to get into definitions. But So this whole notion that somehow you can rely on a passage from the Bible or what Jesus said or what God said or what Allah or anybody else said, if you're going to use religion as the justification or the ultimate authority on ruling and asserting power over people, this goes back to that Nawal el-Saadawi, Egyptian activist who said democracy cannot coexist with capitalism and religion. Her point is proven out just by Jeff Sessions and Sarah Huckabee Sanders, quoting biblical references to following the laws of governments that are ordained by God. I mean, give me a freaking break. But anyway, and that kind of is going to get me back to the definitions that I want to talk about. But before I get there, a couple of other things I want to do. I want to mention that on Wednesday, June 27th, that's not this Wednesday, that's next Wednesday, I am co-hosting an event at the Brooklyn Commons at 388 Atlantic Avenue. It is June 27th from 6:30, thereabouts, 6:30 to 9 p.m., and it's about stopping the Williams Pipeline, the NESE Williams Pipeline, which is a pipeline that's going to carry natural gas through the New York Harbor, jeopardizing, not just jeopardizing the coastal waters of New Jersey and New York and even Pennsylvania, but when I say New York, I mean Long Island, the whole bit. Not just jeopardizing it because of potential disasters that occur with pipelines bursting, but even installing and constructing the pipeline is going to churn up 150 years of contamination in the New York Harbor, which is just look. There are so much that that industry has done to destroy waterways, not just groundwater, but river water. The Hudson River, for instance, is there are sections of the Hudson River that are so contaminated, but over time, enough silt and enough dirt covers over that contamination, and it gets to the point where to clean that contamination, GE, for instance, was charged with all kinds of environmental violations of the Hudson River, and through an environmental evaluation, they determined that cleaning up the Hudson River would cause more damage than leaving it. And I know that sounds absurd, but it's, in a way, some of it's almost believable, because the idea of trying to dredge layers and layers of contamination that's already below and covered up by by silt and soil that is that's created layer after layer on top of this stuff. You can understand that, and that's the circumstance in the New York Harbor. In order to install this pipeline, they are going to have to disturb an area that has been receiving, like I said, contamination from New Jersey, from down the Hudson River. I mean, it really has a tremendous risk environmentally. And so we're going to talk about that event. I'm actually going to talk about how the folks here in Seneca Territory combated and fought off this the local town in Pennsylvania, Coudersport, from taking hydrofracking wastewater into their wastewater treatment facility, only to have the discharge into the headwaters of the Allegheny. I think that fight, and I'll call it a fight, but that resistance and the amounts of alliances that were forged by the Seneca people who mounted the resistance to this thing showed a very, very positive way to combat some of these environmental challenges. And so we're going to talk. That's what I'm going to bring to the table in this event. Again, that's Wednesday, June 27th, 6:30 to 9 p.m. at the Brooklyn Commons at 388 Atlantic Avenue. It's a Stop the Williams Pipeline organizational meeting. So that's what I've got planned for my Wednesday, last Wednesday of the month event in New York. One of the things is I just posted a meme a little while ago, and I want people to I want people to think about what I've said here. And what I said is, let's be honest. When white people say something is un-American, what they mean He said that can't happen to them. So when white people say it is just wrong to rip kids away from, not just that it's wrong to rip kids away from parents, but that it's un-American, they don't mean that it hasn't been stretched, that same thing hasn't been stretched through American history, because it absolutely have. What they mean is that would be terrible if it happened to white people. But it did happen to black people. It did happen to Native people. And it is happening to brown people. And so I just think the idea of framing this use of the word un-American, I mean, because we hear this all the time, about what is American, what isn't American. Hey, look, it's nice to say that lassie and apple pie and hot dogs and all these things that seem so benign are American culture. But let's be clear, American culture is just riddled with atrocities, everything from slavery to genocide to, Japanese internment, dropping atomic bombs on Japan. I mean, just these absolutely atrocious things. So when somebody says that something is un-American, I mean, look, when I hear somebody say North Korea has nuclear weapons and they're not afraid to use them, and I hear an American say that, I mean, there's just something really bizarre about that. There's only one country that apparently was not afraid to use a nuclear weapon, and they did it twice. So to say that another country is acquiring this weaponry and they're not afraid to use them, of course they're afraid to use them. I mean, the whole idea, fear is exactly what nuclear weapons are all about. The whole idea is that everybody's supposed to be mortified and terrified about the use of nuclear weapons, including the people who use them. Of course, the United States didn't have to worry because nobody else had one when they lit theirs off. So I think this idea about something being un-American, look, we want to look historically, there's a whole lot of things that are very, very American that you don't want to claim ownership to. But you do want to say, we can't allow this stuff to happen to white people. So that's my my meme out there. By all means, if you catch it, if you want to share it, do so. And and let's again spark up a conversation about it. So after last week's show, I did receive a couple of criticisms, and among them, and one of the first ones was I think when I posted the show, and I didn't do it on every one of my posts, but on one of the platforms that I posted on, I said something along the line that I referred to these children, these immigrant children being ripped from the parents. And so I was scolded a little bit. They said, they're not immigrants. That's what I was told. They're not immigrants. And so I said, yes, I'll take that. You're right. That, to refer to these children as immigrants is not appropriate. I did try to clarify and say, but it is an immigration policy. So while I think it's unfair to refer to people who I think are from the Americas originally, their ancestry is from here, to refer to anybody of this continent, again, their ancestry of this continent, moving anywhere within these continents as immigrants is just wrong. So the first criticism was I shouldn't call them immigrants. And I said, okay, I stand corrected. But then I heard some other criticism from, and in fact, it was even from some of the people who we're referring to here, who said, don't call us indigenous. All right. So can't call them immigrants, can't call them indigenous. It's like, all right, what are we left with? Now, granted, this is what I want to talk about with this show today. I want to talk about definitions because I have some, pun intended, but some reservations about using words like indigenous, because indigenous, even as defined by the United Nations, suggests that we are an original population that are dominated by colonialism. So embedded in the definition of the word indigenous is the sense of being under dominion by settler colonialism. And I find that problematic because to me, when you define somebody as being under dominion or being dominated by somebody, that's That's not a definition I choose to use. Now, I understand when people say indigenous, they just mean the original population, but that's not the way things are always defined. And that's why definitions are so important. Now, the crazy thing about the word immigrant is that there's almost like no difference between the idea of a migrant or an immigrant. When you look up the definition, I mean, in fact, the synonyms are, for an immigrant is a migrant, or for a migrant is an immigrant. I mean, it's and yet we do look at the idea of a migrating population of anything as just, for the most part, a species, if it's an animal or if it's human migration, that has a pattern of movement within a landmass. And I would argue that many of the people who get caught up into this whole border issue, this man-made wall, whether it's a physical Trump wall yet or not, are of a people whose ancestry had a migratory pattern. And so, again, these words can be difficult to navigate, and oftentimes, because the way they're used with some sort of negative connotation. I mean, you don't call somebody an immigrant because you're praising them. I mean, even when you get someone like Andrew Cuomo saying, "Well, we're all immigrants." I mean, it's almost like he's trying to say, all Americans need to bring themselves down to that level, kind of thing. So it's not meant to be praiseworthy. Of course, he always has to give this little side note. He says, unless you're native. But then he goes, but we're all immigrants. He ignores the fact that 10 million people were brought to this hemisphere as part of the transatlantic slave trade, but that's a whole other issue. All right. So I'm going to spend, after we go to break here, when I come back, I want to talk about some definitions, because there are words that we use, and frankly, I use too, all the time, that I think there's some caveats that have to go along with that. So that's what I want to talk about when we come back. So we'll take a break here, and then when we come back, I'm going to talk about some definitions, and perhaps some definitions that may take you a little bit, may surprise you a little bit. But we'll do that when we come back. This is John Kane. This is Let's Talk Native.
Love me, said I was your desire, acting strange lately, trying to drive my love away. I'm cutting out on you, baby. Girl, I'm going back up the line. If I stay another day, you're going to drop me out of my mind. Child made all kinds of promises to me, and I know you were lying and driving. I'm cutting out on you, baby. Girl, I'm going back up the line. If I'm staying another day, you're going to drop me out of my mind.
All right, thanks for coming back. That was Up the Line by Freight Train, Robert Freight Train Parker. We opened up with Razor Wire by John McLeod. And, the reason I wanted to open up with Razor Wire is because we can associate this idea of a fence with razor wire on it as a prison fence. And Look, that's what you have around places like Gaza, and that's what is associated with some of these concepts for a Trump wall or the existing fence lines that existed. So it isn't just an inmate staring up at razor wire. Oftentimes, these are the kind of cruel barriers that man creates to control people. I mean, it really is about control and domination over people. I mean, the idea that you'll fence somebody in or fence somebody out. I mean, and look, and I'm not gonna suggest there isn't at some level, a need to remove people from the general population of society. I think it's an abused act, and the United States is, get the highest prison population than any other people on the planet per capita. It's not even close. There are more people in prison or on parole in the United States per capita than I believe, and I may be wrong here, but I'm pretty sure more than all the rest of the countries combined. More than Russia, more than China, which is a bigger population, right? But per capita, I mean, it's incredible. But so I wanted to play razor wire, and I've had to stare at my own razor wire before, for a variety, and for a variety of reasons, but not the least of which was just standing up for the things that I believe in. All right. I guess before I get into it, let me give a shout out to my sponsors. I want to thank Ross and Holly John and the RJE family of businesses, Mike General, and Mikey G's and Mikey's Emporium, Eric White, ERW Enterprises, Legacy 420. And I want to thank individuals like Ed Schindler, who's coming back to the show here, probably not next show, but maybe next week, later in the week. We'll see. Ed Schindler, who supports the show. Cynthia Trice, a good friend and a supporter of the program. Roger Jock, Neville Spring, and others. So I want to thank thanks for the support. I also want to thank Unity Stream and Apache Radio Net for providing our streaming, and give another special thanks out to the Gway, to CKWE in Tandanega for both the simulcast and the rebroadcast of this show, as well as thanking some of our internet partners, Netroots Radio, Real People's Media, Indigenous Resistance Radio. I want to thank all of you for carrying Let's Talk Native on your networks and again, helping to expand the platform for some of these conversations. I also want to thank all of you who have group pages that allow us to post links to our show, whether it's the Facebook live stream or whatever. I want to thank all of you who allow our postings to go onto your group pages. And, of course, I want to thank my wife, Brenda, and Donna Fan Boyle, and so many others who share this program as a Facebook live stream, and the rest of you who share it as SoundCloud audio and YouTube videos. And, of course, I'm hoping I can get a few of you to start sharing the podcast as well. So, look, you can subscribe to the podcast on iTunes, and you can also subscribe to our YouTube channel, which is Let's Talk Native TV. And I encourage you to do both. That way you'll get notifications. It'll the shows will come to you. You don't have to go looking for them. They'll come to you automatically. So I want to suggest that you do that. Look, definitions. There are words that we use all the time, and they've almost become words that we think have some sort of special native significance. Sovereignty is one that comes to mind. We use that word. I've used it so often. I have tried to take the time to define what I mean when I say sovereignty. But, at the end of the day, I'm still using one of their words. And so many of these words that we use are not, they don't have an origin with us. I mean, there's some words you can use. I don't use American Indian or Native American, but I use the word native. And it's because it's more benign. It doesn't have any, real specific definition. It's more of a general word that when you say it, people know what you mean without necessarily saying, okay, you're an American Indian, and so you're an American, and you are still using this misnomer that was placed upon you by Columbus, so you're still calling. No, so I don't want to do that. Native American, nothing. I may be Native, but I'm not American. And so the suggestion that I have somehow adopted all of those cultural intricacies associated with American culture, or the lack of American culture, I should say. Look, I don't want to be a part of that conversation either. Again, I know I'm speaking English, and we're using technology that maybe doesn't have traditional origins to it. That doesn't mean that it's not any more our technology than it is anybody else's. But so again, these words do matter. And I know there's a lot of native territories that are still referring to themselves as Indians or some other word that wasn't really theirs in the first place. I think of like the Sioux, for instance. The word Sioux is not a word that a Dakota would really wants to be called. So when they say Standing Rock Sioux, Standing Rock is, again, it refers to a place, but they don't say Standing Rock, Lakota. And so some of the stuff is problematic. The Seneca Nation is finally ripping the word Indian out of the name. So instead of saying the Seneca Nation of Indians, they're just Seneca Nation. And they're starting to use their own word, Onondaga, more prominently in their letterheads and in a lot of their communications. But there are still words that we use all the time. I mean, the word Seneca is not really, it's not a Seneca word. The word Seneca is not Onondaga. It's a Roman orator from, Caesar's times. I mean, it's from ancient Rome. I mean, it's bizarre that we allow these words. I'm Gunyagahaga, but if I don't tell you that means Mohawk, then it throws people off. But Mohawk's not one of our words either. So I guess what I wanted to get into, not to just criticize every word, but I wanted to talk about certain definitions. Sovereignty, for instance. I mean, that is a word that we use, and oftentimes we use it, we stick another word in front of it, so we'll say tribal sovereignty, because we don't want to really mean sovereignty. But when we use the word sovereignty, oftentimes we're just meaning the right to decide for ourselves. I mean, that's kind of what we say, so the right to be autonomous or independent, or to be a free and independent people. That's what we mean. But the problem is that's not what the word means. It actually means having supreme power or authority. It means like to assert dominion over a land. So the word sovereignty doesn't mean anything associated with being free and independent. It actually is a word associated with power and authority. So the question ends up being, well, who has power and authority? And oftentimes it specifically is associated with what they call the sovereign, which is the entity or the individual that has that authority. And of course, where does that authority come from? It goes back to Jeff Sessions, right? And Romans, right? They're saying that this authority really comes from God. That's how the royal family, right, exists. The royal family has claimed for thousands of years, or 1,000 years anyway, that God chose them and that they are ordained by God to wield authority over other people, to hold dominion over other people. And so when Jeff Sessions says, well, according to the Bible, it says that you must obey governments. You must obey governments. I mean, think about that. I mean, you must obey them. I mean, they are the authority, and that authority is ordained by God. Now, don't ask me how a country like the United States, which claims to have separation of church and state, could be a country whose authority was ordained by God. I mean, look, I know they stuck it on the coin, right? It says it on the dollar, "In God we trust." Even after they say separation of church and state, and that nobody's required, the government can't impose religious views, although they do it every single time. In fact, that's what Jeff Sessions is doing. So, but it gets tied back to that word sovereign and sovereignty. So I guess the question should be, and there was some debate in one of the listservs that I'm on over the doctrine of Christian discovery, should we even be using that word? And as much as I've used it, I'm troubled by it now, because I know what the word means. And I know when native people say it, they think they know what it means. But here's the problem. If you're not going to refer to a word that is asserting your free and independent existence. But instead, you're going to use the word like sovereignty, or that we are a sovereign people. Wait a minute. So now you're not talking about a free and independent existence. Now you're talking about authority and power and dominion over something and where that comes from. So, and we get into a debate, even from a political science standpoint, where is sovereignty vested in various types of governments? So in a monarchy, the sovereignty is vested in the king, right? It's in the royal family. That's where that's, again, one of the biggest lies ever told, that God, specifically chose a family, or 13 of them, to be these royal families of Europe, these Christian nations of Europe. They embrace Christianity because they claim that Christianity is what embraced them. So we understand where a monarchy comes from. But what about other forms of government? Really, a monarchy is not much different than a dictatorship or a specific ruler with this authority, and that they are the sovereign. Ruth Bader Ginsburg, when she cited the doctrine of Christian discovery in City of Sherrill versus Oneida in 2005, she said the title to the land became vested in the sovereigns. So she wasn't referring to us. She knew that we weren't the sovereigns. She was saying the title to the land became vested in the sovereigns, first the discovering nations of Europe. Because even this Jewish woman sitting on the Supreme Court assumed that it's the Christian nations of Europe who could claim sovereignty, not only in Europe, but once they step foot on our lands, could claim to be the sovereigns here. So a liberal Jewish Supreme Court justice suggests that we weren't the sovereigns. So even when people say, well, of course we were sovereign before the white man showed up here. No, we weren't. You know why we weren't? Because that word didn't apply to us. We didn't embrace that kind of concept, this idea of authority and rule and dominion. And I know, look, we've all been affected by Christianity and male dominant cultures and and all of this stuff that came from Europe and other places. But really, the word sovereign, in our word, we have a Tewatatawi, which means we carry ourselves. I mean, that just means you have the right, authority, and responsibility to carry yourself as a human being, to provide for yourself and for your family. That's a long ways different. I mean, that's about rights and responsibility, not about authority, not about power over land or over anything else. But the word sovereignty is associated with power and authority, not with independence or free existence. So do we really want to use that word? I mean, even if we're going to go through the painstaking effort of redefining all of these words not meant for us, and hey, it doesn't stop there. I mean, another word we use all the time is nation. I've often, and I've talked about this on the show, I don't know that we are or were nations by the definition of that word. I think we were peoples, and we are peoples. We are people, because nations aren't about culture. Nations are about a common political ideology. They're about a defined border. I'm not even, look, I know people post all these maps about where native territories were, and there's a line there. And the problem is, I don't know that we had borders in the same way. I mean, yeah, there may be some natural borders like the oceans and various rivers or mountain ranges and that kind of thing. But we weren't a people that built walls. We didn't have this artificial sense of this is a line that you can't cross. Now, I'm not saying there weren't turf wars or battles over hunting grounds and gathering areas and stuff like that. Yeah, I'm sure there was some of that. But the idea of mapping a line in the sand to say that you can't cross this. I mean, again, the word nation and nationhood is probably not a word that accurately applies to us as a people. And, this gets back to that whole idea of borders and lines and this immigration kind of thing, right? See, the other word that I think people have to, because I hear people say it all the time, I'm a sovereign, I'm a citizen of a sovereign nation. I'm thinking about the number of words that just got thrown into that. A citizen of a sovereign nation. I'm a sovereign citizen of a sovereign nation. Well, do you know what the word citizen, how that defines? It says a legally recognized subject of a state. See, again, I don't know that any of us consider ourselves a subject or subjugated, placed under rule of, even of again, more twisted words, tribal governments. I mean, I don't know that the Seneca people, the Nundawaga, are subjects to the Seneca Nation Council or president, or even from a traditional standpoint. We've never, according to the Guyana de Goa, we weren't subjects. We weren't underneath the chiefs or clan mothers. That's, we have a specific, exact definition that opposes that concept, that our heads are all at the same level. We seek shelter under the tree of peace, but that's not saying that we're subjugated by that tree of peace. So when we use words like citizen or sovereign or nation, or and it gets worse. When we say things like members, I'm an enrolled member of the Seneca Nation of Indians, or the Oneida Indian Nation of New York. Really? Why can't we just say you're Onyota Aga or you're Onondawaga or you're Gonyaga Aga? We can say that. And if we have to explain, that's our word for what you know as Mohawk, because that's not our word, or that's our word for what you know as Oneida or Seneca. Look, if I don't mind defining our words to somebody who doesn't know our language, I find it a little bit more troublesome to have to redefine English words so I can make them fit me. So this idea of definition is important because the words matter. Stephen Newcomb wrote a column in Indian Country Today. He said, "Were we tribes before white men came?" And I'm paraphrasing it. It may not exactly be the words he used. Before Europeans came to our shores? And the answer is no. You know why we weren't tribes? Because that's not our word. It's not our concept. We were peoples, and again, even as we get into the definition of our own words. So when I say I'm Ganyagahaga, and I live in the territory of the Onyota or the Onundawaga, really, I'm Ongoyong. I'm just a native person. I'm a real human being. And when I say Ganyagahaga, I mean that I come from a people from the land of Flint. It doesn't mean that I live there, because I don't live there. I live here. We got into this whole sense of identity crises, even amongst our own people, or in and amongst our own people. So, although I live amongst the Onondawaga, I'm not quite Onondawaga because I am not an enrolled member of the Seneca Nation of Indians. This is the madness that we get involved in with these debates, and we get into this debate about identity and blood quantum, or how you determine somebody's again, are you Seneca or are you Mohawk, and what does that mean? But see, in our language, so when I say Onondawaga, it just means the people of the hills or the mountains here, the big hills. That's what it means. The people of a place, and a place that has this definition. Even the original word that, or the name for who we call Tuscarora now, was Katantanuaga. Katantanuaga meant the people of the land of the cypress tree, or the sunken pine, as they called it, whatever. But the people of that land where there were where the trees were in the water, essentially. So, I mean, the Cayuga, the people of the land of the marshlands or the swamplands. So it doesn't mean that because I'm Mohawk, Gunyagahaga, people of the land of Flint, that I'm that Flint is somehow associated with every aspect of my life. I'm not Fred Flintstone, but what it means is that it was one of the characteristics of the lands that were predominantly settled by my people. And so we're only given distinction by where we lived, not by that wasn't really our identity. It was just a description of where we came from. So I think these words matter. So when we talk about things like sovereignty and nation and citizenship and membership, those things diminish what we're talking about, who we're talking about. Because again, when we use our words, that aga, that onundawaga, that aga means the people. And we're not the only people that have these words. So when people say Anishinaabe or Ojibwe or Shinnecock or Unkachuk, all of their words usually mean the people of something, of a place, or some description of the land. But we all call ourselves the people, the Dene, the people. So, I think it's important that people understand that when we use the words that have been imposed upon us, or even the words that weren't imposed, the ones that we try to grab because we think that it sounds smart, I don't know. So we use the word sovereignty, and all of a sudden that becomes like a word that, some people, when they hear the word sovereignty, they associate it with Native people. And, and when I was using it oftentimes because in the context that we've seen it used internationally, we've talked about the United States going into Afghanistan or into Iraq. And they said, well, after they occupied those countries, those nations, they essentially had seized their sovereignty. And then at some point transferred their sovereignty back to them. Again, this is, some of this stuff is crazy to think about. But so when they use that expression, I often at times would come back and say, well, when did they claim that they seized our sovereignty? And the crazy part is they didn't. They never have claimed to seize sovereignty. You know why? Because they never considered us sovereign in the first place. Even though Justice John Marshall would say the sovereignty of Native peoples was necessarily diminished upon discovery. He said that. But, he's a judge. The reality is they only considered the Christian nations of Europe to be sovereigns. And everybody else was just somehow less than them. They couldn't have sovereignty because they weren't a sophisticated or civilized enough people to embrace such a concept. Now, what I will say is they have to have recognized that we were a free people and an independent people. And I would argue, when did we give that freedom up? And when did we give that independence up? Now I know, the first thing people can say is, well, of course you're not independent. You guys collect, federal funds. Yeah, but you're not understanding what those federal funds are associated with. The question I think we have to ask is, when did we give up our freedom? Again, I go back to the Canandaigua Treaty, and I'm not a big fan of it. But when I hear the representatives of the United States, the representatives of the President of the United States saying, we recognize that the land is yours, the United States will never claim the same, nor interfere with the free use and enjoyment, or disturb the people in their free use and enjoyment. See, it doesn't even say freedom, because even freedom has the word domination in there. So it's almost like free, but free under subjugation. People understand that word subjugation means under, and it means under the yoke. Like you put a beast of burden under that yoke, and they pull a plow or a wagon or whatever else. So what they mean, you are free. You are a free subject. You are free under the yoke of a sovereign. And that's not so freedom. I'm not interested in. I am interested in being a free and independent people. So, again, I know we can become tongue-tied thinking about what words we can and can't use. And, some people are perfectly comfortable calling themselves Indians and calling themselves subjects. My good friends in Hawaii, they insist that they are not Americans, that they are Hawaiian subjects. They are subjects of the Kingdom of Hawaii. Of course, they embraced a kind of a European model of a monarchy themselves, but at least it was theirs. It wasn't imposed upon them. They chose that for, and that's their view of how they view themselves. But that was stripped away. Now, there was no question that Europe recognized Hawaiians, the sovereignty of the Hawaiian kingdom, and I know that because they had diplomatic relationships that they had embassies and consulates all over Europe and other parts of the world before the United States came and violated it, and the rest of the world looked the other way and pretended they didn't see it. So, again, I think this idea of we can use the English language. We just have to be careful what words we want to use. And if we're going to use certain words that have complex definitions, we better take the time to make sure that we're providing the definition or avoid the word completely. So anyway, that's my show for today. Again, it's a bit of a mixed bag, but I did want to broach the subject with definitions and with words. So let's be careful what we use and how we use it, I guess. So anyway, we'll be back here on Friday. I'll be doing my show in New York on Thursday from 10 till noon. You can tune me in at wbai.org, or we will be streaming Facebook Live as we do all our shows, so you can catch us there. This is John Kane. This is Let's Talk Native. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you on Friday.
Blast from the past. Do you hear my engine roar? I'm a blast from the past. Just let that engine roar. And when you hear me coming, I'll have that